Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 23rd of February 2022. Today's session is in two parts. The first panel is with witnesses from the National Audit Office, because we want to discuss with them their estimates for 2022-23, the next financial year. And later we'll be talking to officials at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy about their annual report and accounts. But the first business today is the National Audit Office's main estimate. That's their budget plans for the next financial year, which is something the committee does every year. And we will, after this panel, pass our views on to the Public Accounts Commission, which is the body in Parliament which has to approve the estimate, in other words, to agree the funding for the National Audit Office for the next year. And we've got to say to them if we've got any concerns or issues about the NEO's proposed spending plans. So I'm delighted to welcome to the committee as witnesses, although of course the CNAG is a standing witness to the committee anyway, but in this sense he's actually answering our questions. And that's Gareth Davies, who's the Controller and Auditor General who heads up the National Audit Office. Daniel Lambauer, who's the Executive Director, an Executive Director at the National Audit Office, who manages the HR and internal processes and finances there, and Rebecca Sheeran, who's an Executive Director at the National Audit Office. So a warm welcome to you. Thank you for coming. Well, you didn't have a choice, but thanks for coming willingly. And I'd like to hand over to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, who's going to kick off. Sir Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Chair. CNAG, good afternoon. You are in the hot seat today. I know this is an arm's length hearing in relation to your latest estimate, but can I just say before I start asking you questions, and you do mention it in your annual report, how much we appreciate on this committee the CNAG's and all of your staff in the NEO's support to this committee. It is exemplary, it is very professional, and above all, your staff are very helpful people to deal with. So thank you very much for all that, and if you'd pass that on, I would be grateful. Yes. You intend to retain 2.1 million of additional funding previously provided for pandemic work. Could you give the committee more information on the pandemic-related activities the NAO still expects to be dealing with, these delayed accounts and so on, and how you expect to get that back to normality, and how you intend to return those funds?
Yes. So for 2021 audits, the round that we've completed recently, we sought that additional funding to cope with both the delays imposed by the pandemic on departments preparing their accounts and our audit work, but crucially the amount of audit work that was needed to cover the risks. So we were dealing obviously with hundreds of billions of expenditure on very new and risky areas of spend, creation of new liabilities for government with uncertain collectability in many cases. So a lot of audit work was required. We were right that we did need that resource. We've used all of that this year, the year just ending. And I think we've delivered high quality audits of some pretty complex accounts. And I think your committee has a hearing on the BEIS accounts today, but also the DHSC accounts in a couple of weeks, and both of those departments needed substantial additional audit work. So that's where we've used it. Nearly all of it's gone on our financial audit work. We've obviously had a very large programme of value for money work on the pandemic as well. We've coped with that within our normal level of VFM resources, rebalancing the programme to deal with that. We've produced other things as well, like the COVID cost tracker, but out of our normal resource level. So the additional amount that you mentioned is for our financial audit extra capacity. We do need that again for the 21-22 accounts, the year just ending, because clearly that still includes a lot of pandemic spending. The furlough scheme ran up to last autumn, you remember. The liabilities are still on those balance sheets, and we need to update our understanding about levels of fraud and error and collectability and so on. So there's still a lot of complex financial audit work to do for next year, which is why we still need that resource. We think then clearly the new spending stops then, we hope, everybody hopes. And so for 22-23 financial year, we expect to need less. And so our forecast shows our financial audit resources going down by that amount by 2024. And we expect then to be at the level we were before the pandemic on that area of our work.
Energy, that's predicated on the basis that departments and other non-government departments actually start auditing their accounts on time. Can you tell the committee what steps you are taking to make sure that happens, and when you expect to get back to normality?
Well, it's a collaborative effort. Every audit is a collaborative effort between the audited body and the auditor. So that's the way we're approaching this with each department and other public body. We want to get back to the position we were before the pandemic, where all main departments had their accounts certified by the summer recess, and around about 80% of all public bodies were on that timetable as well. Our plan is to get back to that for summer 2023. We'll take a big step this summer, where we aim to be at 70%, but there will still be a small number of departments that won't make it this summer. Department of Health and Social Care is the obvious example. But even in that case, we are working with them on a 2-year plan to be back pre-recess in 23. This depends on, as I say, good collaboration. It does require those departments to prioritise this. So in all my conversations with permanent secretaries, as in their role as accounting officers, we've been stressing how significant a priority this is for the departments who have a lot of catching up to do. Every permanent secretary in that situation has agreed that is a priority for them. They are allocating the resources, and we've seen that happening. So at the moment, I'm confident that we can deliver that 2-year plan. But obviously, I'll let the committee know if I get concerned at any stage in the process.
Thank you very much for that. So can I ask about your excellent staff? And obviously you want to retain them, and obviously you want to reward them in a reasonable manner. So you're proposing in these estimates an increase of 2%. It is the largest part of your estimate. Do you consider that is the right level of increase to retain staff, and what is the position on retaining staff at the moment?
Obviously, it's one of the tougher decisions you have to take in my role as the head of any organisation. But as the committee knows, the quality of our work entirely depends on the quality of our people. We have a good track record of retaining high-quality people and attracting people to apply for vacancies as well. And so one of the things I keep a close eye on is our ability to fill posts from the external market as well as through internal promotions, our retention rates in each grade, the feedback we get from exit interviews. We obviously were keen to understand why somebody's leaving, and is it to do with pay. And obviously my conversations with staff in the organisation, which go on all the time. So and we have now a monthly staff survey rather than an annual staff survey. So we have a very regular barometer check on what people are feeling. We also have an active union who feed back their views to us as well. So all those inputs, what I'm trying to balance here is being a responsible steward of public money. That's what we're spending here. Making sure that we can secure high-quality people and keep the people that we've spent a lot of time developing as experts in these areas, and fill posts in the external market. At the moment, that's going okay. I mean, we've seen turnover in some of our key grades, particularly newly qualified auditors. That's our most marketable commodity. The firms it's a very tight market in the accounting firms at the moment. They're very keen to recruit our people when they qualify. At the moment, we're just above our target level of turnover for that grade. We target 15%, which is a kind of healthy level for turnover at that level for us. Obviously, if it was 0, we'd have nowhere to promote our trainees to, so we do need some turnover. At the moment, it's tracking at 16%, so just 1% above the level. But we're never complacent about this because it's a lagging indicator. By the time you've seen the turnover rate climbing high, it's a bit late to be doing anything about it. So we think this is a kind of medium level risk for us at the moment. 2% is, I think, the minimum I can recommend that would be responsible here. Any less, I think I'll be running serious risks on retention. Any more, and we're then into the problematic area of public sector pay, and I think people who work for the NAO accept they're part of the public sector. They knowingly join the public sector to do this job, and there are trade-offs. There's a better pension scheme at the NAO than they would get in any of the firms now if they join the firms at this stage. So there are other factors that people take into account, and the kind of just inherent interest in the work, which is what many people are at the NAO to do. So you can see we're weighing all those factors all the time. We think this is about right.
So in your report, you make it clear that you are targeting your pay increases towards the younger element, the newer element, and any organisation is vitally dependent on its new young talent coming in. What sort of measures are you taking to recruit youngsters? Do you run a good apprenticeship scheme for those that are not qualified? And what do you do to attract those that are recently qualified?
Well, first of all, you're right. We're the 2% pay rise across the board. We're asking for a further 1% to target the lower end of our grades, because that's where we see pay gaps where, for various reasons, people have fallen behind, and we do need to do some catching up there. On your question about recruiting younger staff, we're one of the country's leading employers of chartered accountancy trainees. We have an intake every year of 70 to 80, which is not as much as the Big Four, but it's certainly a significant. We're a significant employer of trainees. We also employ people straight from school at 18 on an apprenticeship scheme. A smaller number than that, but that's still an important area. And we have an intern scheme every summer as well, where we take on 12 to 15 interns targeted there on people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds as part of our social mobility work. So, and we've had great success on that scheme in the last couple of years about converting interns into applicants to our graduate programme, because typically they're second-year university students, and they've become successful trainees and qualified auditors. So there's a very active pipeline there. We also recruit not just in London and the South East, but to our Newcastle office as well, and so a significant recruitment programme in the North East as part of that effort.
You read my mind. The next question is about Newcastle, but in particular moving on to office space. Do you have an office in Newcastle, or are you going to negotiate for a new one?
Yeah, I might bring Daniel in for some of the detail here, but yes, we have two offices, our main London office and then an office in Newcastle. There's about 90 desks in that office in Newcastle compared to 460 in London, so it's obviously a smaller office. But we're coming towards the end of that lease. But Daniel, do you want to say a bit about the lease term? And
yes, the lease term in Newcastle expires 2023, so we are now putting together a strategy, thinking about what space we need in Newcastle, so that work has begun in time to be able to renew the lease.
I mean, is there a particular reason why you need to be negotiating in Newcastle? Are office rents there higher or lower? Is it a good place to recruit? What's the reason for selecting Newcastle?
The reason we went there in the first place, before my time, but the reason we went there in the first place is following our clients, essentially. So there were large DWP, HMRC, and other public body client sites in the North East. I think so. We were levelling up before quite a lot of government, I think, in that sense. But we're watching very closely now how government is relocating significant chunks outside London, and so we're keeping an open mind about that. It's too early for us to commit to potentially a third site, because obviously there will be fixed costs associated with that, and so we'd need a really good business case for doing that. But as you know, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Community is relocating to Wolverhampton. So we're bearing in mind is a Midlands base for the NAO a useful thing for the future? What about the impact of hybrid working? Like most organisations, we have developed a new way of working through the pandemic. We're mostly office based, but we do a lot of work on client sites out and about. So there could be an argument for a third base, in which case that would give us another pool of recruiting to do. But Newcastle has been a really good location for us, both in cutting down travel time to those organisations I mentioned, but crucially access to an employment market there with some really high quality people. We're a very attractive employer in that city.
Being railed in these committee hearings against the government having taken out very high-priced leases, fixed-term leases of 25 years. Now, pandemic, the rents have come down disastrously from those original leases. I imagine there might be some very cheap office spaces available in those regional offices.
We hope so, yeah. Actually, the number of options on our list is not as long as you might have expected, partly because we're insisting that it prepares us for our net zero target, because we're aiming to be net zero by 2029 as an organisation, and this shift is a big opportunity for us for the Newcastle office to make sure we've got the right heating and so on arrangements in place. So that does cut it down a bit, but there's still a good choice even with that criteria.
Again, you've read my mind, because I was coming on then to your London office. And there's two aspects to this. One is your net zero target of putting in the heat pump and so on, which would be useful if we just say a word or two about it. But in particular, there seems to be an awful lot of surplus office space in the Westminster area. The House of Commons itself has a huge building that it's struggling to let. And I'm wondering if there's all too many people in the public sector got offices, big offices, and whether there is an opportunity somehow between certainly the House of Commons and yourselves to actually collaborate a bit more on offices to your mutual advantage.
It's you're right. It's a very live topic. There's one constraint on us with our property, which is auditing ethical standards prevent us from subletting to public sector bodies that we audit. And we ran into some difficulty with the audit regulator, again before my time, who pointed out that where this was a significant item in the accounts of the body renting space from us, that was a real problem. So we do have quite a strict policy on. So that complicates the cross-government collaboration point that you mentioned. But you're right. I mean, we are making efficient use of our London office space, and so we're, as the plan sets out, we're increasing the amount of space that we're letting out. We've had a very successful programme. I mean, over the last 2 years, all of our lettable space has been let and is earning income. This obviously reduces the cost of the NAO to Parliament, and of the increased space we've made available, 4 more areas. One of those we've already let, and we've got inquiries into others. So good progress despite the challenging market conditions that you mentioned.
And just, it is worth, I mean, you mentioned your net zero policy, just mentioning the heat pump that you're putting into your office to try and achieve that.
Yes, that's a couple of years away. So we've mentioned it in the plan because it's in the third of the 3 years that we look ahead in our rolling programme, part of our capital programme. So we've already had kind of engineering advice that there is a technical solution to a building of our kind, because it's obviously a 1930s construction building, refurbed about 20 years ago. But it is technically possible to heat that way. But we're a long way away from specifications and detailed designs and so on.
I've got 2 other topics before the chair calls time on me. What other possibilities are there for you increasing your income, whether it be in the UK or from advice you give to the EU or further afield?
Again, I'll bring Daniel in on the income side. I mean, the rental of our properties is obviously a significant one. I mean, earning money from our work is an interesting question actually about resource allocation, because we don't aim to make a profit on our chargeable work for obviously auditing public bodies. Our job is to cover our costs, including our overheads. I won't subsidise international work. Quite a lot of international audit tenders, because we have to tender for quite a lot of international work. What we find is that some equivalents of the NAO from other countries will offer to do work at very subsidised rates because there's a strategic reason for wanting to be the auditor of that organisation, that international organisation. Our policy is never to do that, so we will only do international work if we can fully recover our costs, including our overheads. So that means sometimes we miss out on price, but we've never seen it as a way of generating a surplus to subsidise other work. That would be a new departure for the NAO, and I'd be a bit concerned about us then starting to prioritise our resources for the wrong reason, if you see what I mean. That I only take on international work where I think it's in the UK's interest to do that. So if it's helping improve the quality of financial management where there's a lot of UK taxpayer money at stake through international development work, for example, then we do that. If the FCDO is very keen that we get involved in a particular project, then of course we will consider that. So, but it's always a kind of UK national interest that determines whether we get involved in international work, rather than me just looking to earn a profit.
Something you don't mention in your estimate report is collaboration with the devolved parliaments. Is there scope for better collaboration with them to ensure that best practice is being learned, particularly on things like the pandemic, across all 4 devolved administrations?
It's quite a topical question, that. Definitely there is the opportunity for that. We do work very closely with our equivalent organisations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The four of us meet on a quarterly basis for covering areas of shared interest. I gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament version of PAC a couple of weeks ago on some work that we do every year as part of our audit of HMRC, we provide assurance to the Scottish Parliament that it's receiving the correct share of Scottish income tax, because as you know, that's now a devolved matter and they can set different rates of income tax. So we audit the amount that HMRC allocates to Scotland based on the taxpayer base in Scotland. So we work very closely with Audit Scotland on that exercise. We collaborate with all of the UK audit agencies on the audit of the EU agricultural funds. Of course, that scheme is now ending, and the last one of those audits will be in 2023. But we're also comparing good practice on the pandemic response, for example, as an obvious one, and other areas where there's some suggestion that Wales is further ahead than England on matters such as evaluation of public spending, for example. So we're always looking for topics where there's something to learn about the different countries.
Yeah, just to come in here briefly, that's absolutely correct. We have so the relevant auditor generals meet roughly every quarter. I meet with my equivalents in the audit offices informally every fortnight and for half an hour, and for more deep discussions every quarter as well. We have around 7 to 8 working groups around the devolved administration, and we build them ad hoc where needed. There was a really active working group around the pandemic responses, but we also share knowledge around VFM more widely in financial audit. There's a separate group as well, digital audit, on external communication matters as well. So there's a really rich exchange and I think very good working relationships across the 4 audit offices.
Very helpful, Mr. Lambert. Final question to you, CNAG. This session on the excess votes gives us an opportunity to sort of query where you're putting your resources. One area where there is a distinct problem is in local government audit. And I'm really sort of almost using this question with your previous experience on the Audit Commission. I'm wondering what you can do to help bolster local government audit firms. What can you give them, for example, more advice, training? Is there more that can be done? Because this is a very fragile sector, as this committee has discussed before.
Yes, I mean it's a big topic, as you say. I mean, we have a formal role, which is to set the code of audit practice for local audit and to provide advice and guidance to the firms based on that code, which means each year we update that and we engage with the firms on that. We have a regular working group with the firms that one of my colleagues chairs, which meets regularly, so to understand how the code is working in practice and any challenges they're having. So all of that works well. Clearly, we're not resourced or equipped to provide training. I mean, we're talking about some of the biggest firms in the country, of course, dwarfing the NAO in terms of overall resources.
It is a very specialist topic, isn't it?
It is, and we have offered to, if new firms want to enter the market, we have offered to help share our experience and so on as part of their induction into the new market. But fundamentally, the market has failed because the firms are finding that the risks outweigh the rewards. And it's as free agents are able to withdraw from the work if they choose to at the end of their contracts. That's the main risk I think that we're facing with local government audit at the moment. And so the tender process that's just getting underway for the new set of 5-year contracts, that's the critical factor here. That needs to restore commercial viability to this market so that the firms not just are prepared to do the work, but they actively want to do well to hit the timeliness targets, which is the big problem at the moment, as well as maintaining overall quality. We're working with the working group that the government has set up to help this procurement become a success. So we're kind of sharing all of our experience as part of that process, and we'll do everything we can within our role to make it work. But clearly, in the end, this is going to require the firms to apply the right level of resource to do a good job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. Peter Grant, MP, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Before I begin, can I place on record a declaration of interest? I'm a qualified member of SIPFA, which still provides a significant number of NAO staff. Mr. Davies, you mentioned in your estimate submission on a number of occasions something called the Audit Transformation Programme. Could you just briefly explain what that's about?
Yeah. I mean, the heart of this is, as every audit firm at the moment is having to overhaul its audit methodology. There are changes in auditing standards. The one that's coming in first is the what's called ISA 315, which is the new risk assessment standard for audit planning. So much more clarity on the approach that auditors are required to take on assessing the risks involved in each audit and preparing a work programme that responds to those risks adequately. So every firm's having to implement that. At the same time, new tools are becoming available, particularly data analytical tools, which are changing the way that auditors think about how they get the assurance they need. So instead of the traditional approach of picking samples of transactions to see whether they support the figures in the accounts, it's now going to be possible to download the entire ledger from the client system and then use data analytic tools to audit the entire population of transactions rather than just a sample. Now that's clearly a more powerful technique as it's refined. It's not in kind of regular use on every audit in any firm yet, but it is coming. And so with all of that going on, we've decided that we will first of all overhaul our entire audit methodology, including the use of data analytics, so that we're compliant with the new standards but taking advantage of developments in the sector. We're replacing 20-year-old software that we use to record our audits at the moment. It's something called MKI, our current system, but it's running out of its shelf life, and it won't be able to cope with the developments that I've mentioned. And so we're procuring a replacement platform. We've had a successful competitive procurement for that, and we're now about to sign the contract with a firm who will be our development partner for developing software. This is going to be a 12-year software contract, and in common with most software now, it isn't the case that you buy a fixed package, install it and use it. It's a platform that will develop over time as new tools become available, all Microsoft compliant and consistent with our overall IT strategy, so it talks to our other systems as well. So pretty exciting time for the audit practice within the NAO, because within 3 years we will have developed, tested, implemented and be using across all of our work this new system that will be deliver, I think, better quality audits more efficiently. Clearly that doesn't come without a lot of work, so there's the system development work, but more importantly, retraining 600 financial auditors, some of whom have been doing it a particular way for 30 years or more. That's a very big organisational change job, so we've got a detailed plan over the next 2 or 3 years to do that, to give it the resource it needs, and to avoid it being a distraction to our core work. So, it's a big programme and engaging a lot of people in the organisation.
Thank you. What parts of the programme would you expect to be delivering during the next year, and what difference will people notice? Clearly it's important that you're keeping up to date with changes in professional standards, but what difference should we expect to see on the Public Accounts Committee? What difference should your client departments expect to see in the way that you audit them in the future?
Well, the first change is the new risk assessment standard. So we're piloting that on a number of our 21-22 audits, the ones that are going on now. And then we'll be rolling that out to all of our 22-23 audits. So that's the first phase. And then the new audit platform is a year behind that. So we'll be piloting the new audit platform a year from now and then rolling it out in 23-24. So that's the sequence. In terms of what audited bodies and the committee will see, I mean, audited bodies will see it first in the shape, we're obviously already, in many cases, downloading data from their ledger systems using new software to do that. For example, our audit of the BBC is working entirely on that basis now, and it's one of our more complex audits, so I think we've proved the effectiveness of that approach. So we'll be extending that to more audits. We're moving to a greater use of reliance on IT controls as well, which has been around for a long time as a technique in external audit, but underdeveloped, I think, generally. And as government systems become more reliable on this particular account, then we aim to put more reliance on that. So they will see that change in our approach as well. As far as, for the committee, I think it really boils down to insight. I think that's what I expect is that we will, in a hearing such as the one you've got this afternoon on Bays, for example, on their accounts, we won't just bring our VFM insights from our work on, say, bounce back loans, but from our external audit, as well as the findings that you could already see in the report. Much more insight into patterns of spending, into strength of the control environment, into ability to drive savings and so on. That's what these tools are. They will equip us with just a better sense of what's really going on in some of these very large organisations.
Thank you. As well as changes to the quality of the audit, both in terms of output and in terms of your sort of day-to-day working with clients, do you expect it to lead to any significant cost savings? And if so, where would those savings appear?
Being very cautious about that. The watchword for auditors at the moment is quality, and we're all under severe regulatory pressure following the scandals in the private sector on failures of audit quality. So our focus there is on making sure that we're meeting the expectations of not just standards but of the regulator. As you know, our audits are inspected by the FRC in the same way as they inspect the big firms. So that is very clearly our priority. If this way of working does mean that some of the kind of grunt work, if you like, of ploughing through very large numbers of samples is rendered unnecessary by very efficient testing of the entire transaction base, then I think there are potentially savings there. We haven't built them into our business case deliberately because we can't guarantee that's the case yet. And I'd rather prove the concept and then say this is the efficiency that we've achieved. The other thing to mention, again, this is not, our business case is not based on this, but I think it's a realistic possibility. Because of the way we're doing the new software platform, we will own the IP of this new software. We will have a development partner, and we'll need an arrangement with them, but it will be ours, and there won't be anything like it anywhere else, which gives us the possibility then of marketing that to similar organisations around the world, including the UK agencies that we've just been talking about. Very early stages, we're not banking on it, but I think it's a realistic possibility, and we're making sure that the contract that we're about to sign carefully paves the way for us to be able to exploit the IP should that become viable.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of anyone watching not familiar with the abbreviation IP, intellectual property, which is effectively the modern equivalent of a copyright on software. Thank you. If I may, Chair, I'd like to pick up on a couple of answers earlier to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown's question. You referred to your own newly qualified staff as, I think, a big marketable asset, and said they tend to be very much in demand by other employers. That could come across as you saying that the NEO is using taxpayers' money to train people up, and then they take the benefit of their skills and experience off to the private sector and work for the benefit of the private sector. Is that an accurate description of what's happening? And if so, is it justifiable? No, I wouldn't characterise it that way. I mean, I mentioned our target for turnover at our audit principal grade, which is our newly qualified grade, is 15%. So 85% of each cohort that trains with us stays at the NAO. And I think that's a very good return. It's far higher than the equivalent figure you would find in any of the firms. So no, we're not doing this to train people up for other people's benefit. We are by far the biggest beneficiaries of that investment. Thank you. And finally, when you answered Sir Geoffrey's question about income generation, and you referred to consideration of overseas work, you gave an example that you might be more likely to look at putting in a bid for work if the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office were particularly keen on it. How far can you allow yourself to be influenced in that way without prejudicing the need for you to be independent when you come to audit the same people? Exactly. So first of all, it's complete segregation of our international work from our audit team dealing with the FCDO. They're not the same people. And this is the scale of any activity we do under that front is extremely low, and obviously
a tiny proportion of the NAO's overall activity with the FCDO. So materially and so on, it doesn't influence our decision making on anything to do with the FCDO. But what I was explaining was sometimes there's a strong national interest in a particular funding programme and a level of concern about the audit arrangements in place for that programme maybe, and so that's where we get involved sometimes in capacity building work for other audit agencies internationally, or doing work directly ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. And just a quick question from me. Sir Geoffrey raised the issue about staff and staff pay, but you also have requested 1.4 million for external expertise, and we know we benefited as a committee from the expertise you've brought in from outside into the higher levels of the organisation. So what external expertise are you buying in, and why is it that you're buying it in rather than putting it on your regular payroll?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'll talk about the audit, the financial audit expertise, which is most of that, but Rebecca might want to come in on what we've done on our hub directors, which I think is what you're referring to, on external recruits with specialist expertise. So on the financial audit side, essentially in response to the inspections of our work by the FRC, we've needed to get more external...
Just the Financial Reporting Council,
who inspect audit work of the firms and ourselves. They have challenged us to improve our work on complex financial instruments, where there's a surprisingly large number of those in government accounts nowadays, right from the former banks acquired by the government through to the student loans company, the bounce back loan scheme, and so on and so on. So we have contracts for specialist advice from some of the firms who have large teams focused on financial instruments, for example. It wouldn't be economic for us to do the same. We have our own centre of excellence, but to deal with the volume of queries at the peak time of auditing, we do need external help for that. Same goes on pension valuations, another very specialist area involving actuarial expertise, and property valuation, requiring qualified surveyors and so on. So those are the areas where quite often the auditor will need to hire their own expert to challenge the valuations provided by management as part of the audit. And so a lot of that resource is going for those areas of advice. But Rebecca, do you want to add on the hub side?
Indeed. I mean, in the last year, we've built up our hubs of expertise in areas like programme and project management, digital, commercial, people and operations, and our analysis hub, which I'll talk a little bit more about. I think what that's enabled us to do is both to build up the work that we're doing in terms of drawing out insight from across our work, both financial audit and value for money work, to produce more of those kind of lessons learned products, some of which you've taken evidence on at this committee, around government's digital transformation programmes, for example, delivering programmes at speed. So it's enhancing our capacity to look across and really draw out that learning and have impact. But it's also, I think, deepening the insights that we're able to bring to bear through our value for money work in particular, enabling us to make better recommendations and cut to the heart of issues more quickly. So, for example, when we were looking at the Green Homes Grant Voucher Scheme, actually we drew quite a lot on our commercial experts and our digital experts to enable us to deliver that work quite quickly and I think quite insightfully. In terms of our analytics hub, we've invested there in making sure that we are using new techniques that are available for us to get the most out of existing data sets that are out there held by government, to do things like what we did for the Environmental Audit Committee, looking at Environment Agency data to look at sewage outflows, but also more novel techniques such as process mining and code-based techniques such as web scraping, which enable us to look at patterns from large data sets that would otherwise be quite inaccessible. So it enabled us to do things like in our work on BBC savings and reform, quite easily look across schedule listings and identify the volume of repeats that are there. It's enabling us to look quite insightfully through, I think, over 5,000 consultation responses we've received on work that we are doing on child maintenance, to pull out the kind of patterns and themes that are coming through in those responses in a way you just couldn't do manually. In terms of process mining, that's something we used or continue to use to look at where there are kind of bottlenecks or rework or challenges in operational processes such as case working systems. So we used that when we were looking at the Windrush compensation scheme to look at how the cases were progressing through and identify things such as the number of cases that are being sent back for rework. So it really deepens what we're able to draw out.
So to do that work, you've had to buy in people from outside, but how have you afforded that? Because some of the, so if you're a commercial expert or a risk expert or a digital expert, you must be very much in demand in the open market.
So it's a bit of a mix. We have brought in some experts from outside, but we have also, particularly in the data analytics, we've got a team that we're able to grow our own as well. So it's a little bit of a blended model.
Yeah, but also the NAO is a strong brand for if you're interested in applying these skills to some of these big public policy challenges. It's one of the best places you can do that. So. And we kind of stand out in the market, if you like, because there's only one of us. And that's some of the feedback we've had about why people have joined us, including from banks and from data organisations and so on. It's the level of interest in the work and they've
been happy to take a pay cut because the work is interesting and
or at least not a big increase. But yeah, because obviously people have different priorities at different stages in their career. But the reassuring thing is we've attracted all sorts of different people with different motivations successfully to a number of these posts in the last 2 years, and that's showing signs of continuing, which is good news.
And certainly we've noticed it on the committee, so people with expertise, but very interesting, and interesting particularly in what you're saying about financial instruments, because that's something that we as a committee value your expertise on, because it is quite hard for lay people, like myself, not in an accountancy background, to get our heads around. But can I thank you very much indeed for your time. We will pass on our comments to the House of Commons Commission, which will be meeting on Tuesday, and myself and Peter Grant are on that commission, so you might hear some of our questions again there. But thank you very much indeed. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently...
Order, order. Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee on the 23rd of February 2022. This is our second panel of the day, and we'll be looking at the annual report and accounts for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's a big set of accounts because in the first year of the pandemic, the department's budget rose from 14 billion to 44 billion pounds, which in most cases permanent secretaries would be quite pleased about, but I think in this case is an awful lot of work for the team at the Department for Business and of course for the National Audit Office to look at. It's hardly surprising though, given that it was managing the COVID business support schemes and of course the really important and successful procurement of vaccines. Due to levels of potential fraud and error, the head of the National Audit Office, the Controller and Auditor General, had to qualify his opinion as it's not yet clear whether money that was spent has been spent where it should have been. So in this panel we're going to be questioning senior officials from the department about the details of the accounts and how they're going to bring them back into order, as well as some of the risks in the department. So I'm really pleased to welcome our witnesses from the department. We have Sarah Mumby, the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We have Tom Taylor, the Strategic Financial Officer, so the man having to do all the difficult maths, and Kim Humberston OBE, who's the Co-Director of Finance, who's making sure that maths is properly done. So a big job for all of you as accounting officer and finance officers in the department. So we understand the challenge and we'll be asking you tough questions about how you're protecting taxpayers' money. But before we go into the main session, you wrote to us very recently about the bounce back loan schemes, Ms Mumby, and James Wilde is just going to pick up some points from that letter. Mr Wilde, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, Ms Mumby, you wrote to us post the hearing where we had quite a lot of discussion about the level of fraud and the recoveries process. You've obviously written to us, but I think it's important we get some of this on the record for people who watched that hearing but may not have read the correspondence. So first, on the recovery period, you stated to this committee that lenders were expected to pursue recoveries beyond 12 months, but that's not correct, is it?
That's right. So there will be circumstances where they will pursue recoveries beyond 12 months. For example, if they've already begun a repayment plan during the 12-month period. So it is true that there will be some legacy activity beyond the 12 months. But the decision made by ministers at the time of the launch of the scheme was that 12 months was a reasonable cap to put on the time that lenders needed to invest in recoveries for no reason other than that after that point it's unlikely that significant recoveries would be achieved unless, as I say, the process had been begun before the 12-month period.
What's the minimum period which banks are required to pursue recoveries for?
There isn't a minimum period per se. If there's evidence in the case of a particular loan that there's no good reason to pursue recoveries, at that point banks can claim on the loan. In most cases we would expect recoveries to have a duration of many months, indeed approaching 12 months, but there isn't a minimum requirement on time.
So would that be, for instance, bankruptcy?
It's a minimum requirement on effort as opposed to time, if you see what I mean. So if there's a company that no longer exists and there's no money to go after, we don't sort of require a process to be carried out for process's sake.
Okay, you also said that lenders had to wait until the 12 months had elapsed to make a claim on the guarantee. Again, that wasn't correct, was it?
That's right. As I just said, they can claim on the guarantee at the point at which they have carried out a sufficient and robust level of recoveries, and that's what the BBB's audit processes will ensure that they're doing.
And obviously some guarantees have already been paid out. What's the shortest period that a lender has claimed the guarantee before?
I don't know that, but I'd be happy to confirm. Absolutely.
On fraud, my reading of the letter is that provided a lender carries out the minimum checks, there's no mechanism for the bank to get that money back if it's subsequently considered to be fraudulent activity. Is that correct?
Providing the bank has carried out their checks at the start when the loan was issued. So there's sort of two cases. The first case is a case where a bank has or hasn't, for example, carried out KYC checks at the point of the loan being issued. If they haven't, then that would be a reason, straightforwardly, why the guarantee would be suspended. Assuming that has been carried out, the question is whether the bank is fulfilling the requirements of the loan agreement in terms of going through their standard recoveries and fraud prevention processes. As long as they're following those processes and are audited to be doing that, there is no way of stopping them claiming on the guarantee. The setup from the very beginning of the scheme was that banks were being asked to put out money in an environment in which we knew there was a risk of fraud, and it was for the public purse to carry that risk, not for the individual banks, unless those banks had failed to comply with those fraud prevention measures at the start of the loan, like KYC.
Okay. Clearly, it's regrettable you made those errors. I mean, why did you, as the accounting officer, misspeak on various points about the recoveries process to the committee? I mean,
as you know, I appear in front of this committee very often. I do my very best to be accurate on all points, and I hope I've got a pretty good record. We all occasionally misspeak. And to be fair, the question about the 12 months, I mean, as you can imagine, I've gone back and kind of checked that very carefully with the team to make sure I understood it. I don't think I had appreciated the full detail of the complexities about the circumstances in which activity did take place after the end of 12 months. As I say, some activity does, but I shouldn't have characterised it in the way that I did.
Yes, okay. Well, no, you do appear regularly and give good evidence. So, a couple of weeks after your evidence, Lord Agnew obviously resigned and made a number of points about the fraud process. One I just want to ask about, he highlighted the lack of a single dashboard or management information to scrutinise lenders, which was something we touched on. When, as accounting officer, will you have that in place?
We're planning to present it to the Cross-Whitehall Counter-Fraud Board that we will be establishing at a more senior level following Lord Agnew's resignation next month.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And because, as you know, this committee is very concerned about the levels of fraud. We want to see lessons learned from what's happened in the pandemic for any future situations, but we will continue to pursue every department, including yours, which is a part of the theme of today's hearing. So I'm going to ask Peter Grant, MP, to kick off. Over to you, Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to all our witnesses. Ms Munby, what's your response to the Comptroller and Auditor General's qualification? Were you surprised that he qualified the accounts?
No, I wasn't surprised. The accounts were qualified for two reasons. One is the levels of fraud, particularly on BBLs, that we've just been talking about. As I said in my answers to James Wilde just now, that's something we knew would happen. It's a risk that we consciously tolerated. I mean, it was the subject of ministerial direction, of course, but I think actually probably many people would see that in that case, the balance of a really, really challenging and difficult and problematic fraud situation was outweighed by the need to act swiftly to save companies and livelihoods that would otherwise have been lost. So that was the first reason that the accounts were qualified. The second was the programme of grants to small businesses that we administered through local authorities. In that case, similarly, those grants, when first launched, were subject to a ministerial direction. For similar reasons, although I would draw at this stage of the conversation, I'm sure we may get into this in more detail, a distinction in that the concern in the case of the bounce-back loans, as we've just been discussing, is particularly around fraud. Although we do not have all of the answers about exactly how this breaks down, all of our evidence to date suggests that the primary issue in the local authority grants is not fraud. There is some fraud, as there is in any scheme, but we would say the fraud is within the kind of normal expectations, and if it was the fraud picture alone, we wouldn't have expected to be qualified on that basis. It's error that really leads to the qualification. And the sorts of error that we're talking about, I just think it's useful for people to understand what we mean by error here. In the sampling work we've done, the nature of the error. The most common, so it's about nearly 3/4 of the overall estimate around fraud and error, which is what led to the qualification. Nearly 3/4 of that is due to what we think may have been, we can't fully verify yet, but what we think may have been errors in the rateable value of a property used to decide on the amount of grant that was received. So it's not a case where the business didn't exist or the business was exercising, carrying out any sort of conscious fraud. It's a case where, for example, the LA's record of what the rateable value of the property wasn't fully up to date. So they might have received, let's say they were somewhere around the 15,000 value threshold for getting a smaller or a larger grant. They might have received the wrong amount of money. Or if they were hovering around the top threshold, where it was a question of whether they would or wouldn't get the money, they might have received it when technically they shouldn't. I don't say that in any way to suggest that this error isn't problematic or isn't something we're very concerned about identifying and managing, but it is of a different, it's of a different type and a different. It's a different sort of problem to conscious fraud, and in most cases what we're talking about is businesses who received a technically wrong amount of money but nevertheless were businesses on the high street who were required to close, who were going through a very difficult time.
Thank you. I suspect if it is the case that local authorities don't have reliable information on the rateable value of the properties that they're charging rates on, it may be something the committee will want to look at in more detail at a later date, but I appreciate that a lot of that isn't within your remit. For the 3 COVID business support grants that you were responsible for, what's your latest estimate of the value of fraudulent applications that you received? What's your estimate of how many of these were stopped before payment? And how much do you expect to recover out of the payments that were made?
So it's worth maybe just laying out, if you'll excuse just a slightly lengthy answer given the importance of the question. There have been several series of grants. So effectively what we in the department call Cohort 1, which was the grants that were issued in the spring of 2020 at the very start of the pandemic. A second series of grants that were issued in the autumn and Christmas time of 2020, and then a more recent set of grants, including the very latest Omicron grants. The picture across that full set of grants is the money going out of the department, just over 26 billion. Not all of that will ultimately be paid out because by nature we've given local authorities definitely enough money. Some of it will be reclaimed to the department. We've already reclaimed over £1 billion, nothing to do with fraud or error, but to do with local authorities having effectively received a generous allocation, not all of which they will spend. In terms of fraud and error, it's really early days to give an exact answer to your question, and I wouldn't be comfortable in giving a kind of clear, it's this many £1 billion, it's this many £1 million answer to that. What I can say is that on the first cohort, and it's the first cohort where the risk of fraud and error is highest for reasons we can discuss but are not difficult to imagine. That was, when we didn't know, neither we nor LAs knew how to do this. It was a first scheme. Our early sampling work, which is based on a small sample, our best estimate of fraud and error is 8.9%. But we've put a really wide range on that, from 4% to 13%, and I stand behind that range, as in this is an estimate around which we have pretty low confidence. What we can see within that, you specifically in fact asked about fraud, is that as I mentioned earlier, we think that fraud is likely to prove to be around the 1 or 2% mark, roughly in line with what you would historically expect for this sort of scheme, even in normal times. It's worth touching on why that is. It's because, unlike in the case of the loans, these grants were tied to property. And so it's not impossible to commit fraud associated with property. But in the main, these are businesses that, as you say, had an existing relationship with their local authority because of the payment of rates, where the existence of the building, as it were, on which the money is being paid is a very clear and verifiable fact. And that's why I think while we don't yet have the kind of the final answer on how much fraud we think there will be, and there's more work to do on that. We're comfortable that fraud for these schemes will be, non-zero, but in line with normal schemes. I think error, which looks like it may have been substantial, although it's really early days to say. For example, on what I was just talking about, that kind of 70% of the of that 8.9%, 3/4 is this question about rateable value. What we haven't been able to do yet is go back on all of those all those grants where we think there might have been an error, and sit down with the LA and say, okay, could you talk me through why you paid this? And I'm sure when we do that, we will discover that some of them are absolutely legitimate. It's the same picture as we saw in bounce back loans when I was here just a few weeks ago, and we talked about the estimate of fraud there, which has already dropped from just over 11% to 7.5%. That's because as we're learning more, we're finding that things that were possible fraud turn out not to have been fraud. And I would expect the same thing to happen on error here. I can't be absolutely confident of that. That's why we've given a range that also includes numbers higher than 8.9. But if you ask me for my judgment at this point, I think it's more likely the number will go down than it will go up. But that is obviously something that we will have to kind of verify and confirm to the committee as we learn more.
Thank you. You mentioned the fact that the fact that a business premise exists is verifiable. How many of them did you verify?
There were not prepayment checks for these schemes. As you can imagine, at the point at which the schemes were launched, the question of prepayment checks was discussed very fully. It was not. We didn't casually launch these schemes without prepayment checks. And just to be clear, what we're talking about when we say prepayment checks is enforcing that local authorities have to carry them out.
We've previously gone into the reasons why there wasn't a lot of prepayment checks, and we've understood that. Have there been significant levels of post-payment checks to actually confirm that the property exists and that it was being used, it wasn't just lying empty?
So if I may just distinguish between the different schemes. So I talked about those cohorts 1, 2 and 3. It's just worth saying that for cohort 3, prepayment checks have been demanded. So the most recent grants are all going out with prepayment checks. For cohorts 1 and 2, local authorities have to go through a post-payment checking process, and then ultimately a recoveries process where they need to both invoice and then remind if there's a need to recover money that has been paid in error. And it's only after the end of that process that then any recoveries return to the department, where we take over. Unlike in the case of LAs, you asked unlike in the case of the loans, you asked at that hearing about had we considered using a third-party recovery agency. We do in this case. So when a grant, I keep saying loan when I mean grant, when a grant comes back to the department, we're using a third-party recoveries agent to pursue recoveries in the same fashion that you would find in lots of different schemes.
Thank you. So at the moment, do you have even a vague idea of what the total loss to the public purse, either through irrecoverable fraudulent payments or irrecoverable overpayments in error? Do you have any feel at all as to how much is going to be lost?
For fraud, I mean, on a sort of very simple basis, I've said that I'd expect it's order of magnitude 1 to 2% in line with similar schemes. If you multiply that by 27 billion, which is the overall size of these schemes, you get a pretty sizable number. That's not because these schemes are any more fraudulent than any other government scheme. It's simply because this is a very large and complex scheme. Error, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying what I think the end size of the error will be, because I don't think we are confident enough in that error estimate. I would say that where we are is certainly in a position where we entirely understood the NAO's position that it looked like there was a material level of error and a sufficient level of error that our accounts should be qualified on that basis. We wouldn't at all take any issue with that. But the size of that error is unknown for any of these cohorts. And I would also say that I expect even that percentage, the 8.9 that I talked about, which was on cohort 1, I would expect that to come down for cohorts 2 and 3. So the overall picture is something we are unfortunately going to have to come back to with more numbers on over time.
Thank you. In his resignation speech, Lord Agnew said that at the start of the pandemic, your department only had 2 counter-fraud officers. He's described them neither in being experienced in the subject. He's also said that the counter-fraud officers that you had didn't engage constructively with counterparts in the Cabinet Office. Is that correct? And
so it's absolutely correct that we only had 2 counter-fraud people in our counter-fraud team at the start of the pandemic. By the way, I don't think that was the wrong number. It's important to say that the historic rates of fraud across the department have been really, really low. This is a 1,000-fold increase in the level of fraud that we're managing as a department coming out through these schemes. So, but it's absolutely factual to say that we had a very small team at that time. Of course, it's significantly expanded now. I think it's fair to say we wouldn't fully recognise the claim that we did not engage with the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function. And indeed, I take the opportunity to say thank you to the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function, who've been a big supportment to the department, including really quite quickly supporting us with adding a deputy director for counter-fraud into the department, borrowed from elsewhere in government, so that we could quickly scale up that team with the right kind of expert resources. And it's fair to say, I mean, you can imagine when I saw that, I went back and asked the relevant teams sort of many detailed questions like, how often have you met with the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function? And it's fair to say that the numbers are, we're meeting with these with the central teams, multiple times a week across the department. So, I haven't heard Lord Agnew's sort of points in detail directly, so I don't know exactly what it is led to him to say that. But from our point of view, we absolutely recognise the point about not having sufficient anti-fraud resources at the beginning of this process because we didn't know what was coming. I wouldn't recognise the point about not having worked closely with the Cabinet Office.
You referred to having historically very low levels of fraud. How certain can you be that it's the levels of fraud that are very low and not just the levels of detected fraud?
Well, it's really to do with the nature of the schemes. So we have had some specific schemes kind of historically in the department on which we've been pushed hard on fraud, the renewable heat incentive being sort of the classic example where the NAO had rightful questions to ask about levels of gaming and fraud. But typically the kind of schemes we would have been running historically, we would have absolutely had in place all of the sort of upfront checks and process that we use to prevent fraud in the first place. That's what you would expect of a responsible accounting officer, and my predecessors were in a position to make sure that happened. The circumstances that led to us launching multiple schemes with what we would all acknowledge were insufficient, but consciously insufficient levels of upfront control is what's led to not just a slight increase in our fraud risk profile as a department, but as I say, a 1,000-fold increase in our fraud risk.
Thank you. There's something else that Lord Agnew said. He described it as schoolboy errors. For example, allowing more than 1,000 companies to receive bounce-back loans which were not even trading when COVID struck. Is that figure something that you recognise, something you're aware of?
Yes, I mean, this goes to the point about what sort of checks were required at the beginning of the process. It was a really difficult balance. How much checks do you ask people to go through at the cost of meaning that loans will be put out much more slowly? I mean, we've sort of litigated the point quite a lot in front of this committee, and I mean, yes, that's right. I mean, I'm not sure it's right to describe it as an error, but it is true.
At what point did you become aware that, as well as being a potential risk, it was turning into a real risk? At what point did you become aware that companies were being set up for what appeared to be primarily the purpose of defrauding you? The reason I'm hesitating is that I wasn't in the seat at that point. So the question you're really asking me is, at what point did my predecessor come aware? And I feel a little bit uncomfortable answering that question. But what I will say is,
we knew from the very beginning that those risks were there. We had a really quite comprehensive, done with external support, fraud risk assessment done before the launch of the scheme. So there was no moment of realisation. It was much more of a question of, OK, these risks are now are coming to light much in the way that we expected. I would say in the case of bounce-back loans in particular, I think our upfront assessment of what would happen proved to be pretty accurate. I don't think there was a prediction problem, if that makes sense. I would slightly draw a contrast. I think it's fair to say that depending on how the numbers emerge, I think we have been more surprised by the level of potential error in the grant schemes. That we knew there would be challenges, but the extent to which that looks like it may have been the case has been a bit more surprising. So I draw that contrast.
During the year that we're looking at, 2020 to 21, did you get any alerts from Companies House that they'd picked up anything unusual in either new company registrations or company dissolutions?
Well, we very quickly had in place various data sharing agreements between the BBB and Companies House, also working with indeed this is another place where the Cabinet Office Counter-Fraud team were involved, to make sure that we were doing data sharing. So that was about being able to put a date check exactly to your point about companies who didn't exist at the right moment. Companies House data allowed us to stop that happening. I don't know, that's not quite your question. So Companies House definitely involved. Your question was specifically around whether we saw any unusual patterns. I'd have to go back and check the records on that specific question.
According to Companies House annual report, between 2015-16 and 2019-20, they averaged about 640,000 new company registrations a year. It never varied more than about down to 610,000 up to 670,000. In 2020 to 21, there was more than 810,000 new company registrations. That's more than 20% higher than any of the previous 5 years. Does it strike you as surprising that should happen during a year when for about half of the year the economy was in lockdown and companies weren't able to trade?
Well, I think I'd be keen to get Companies House's opinion on that specific question before I answered in full. But it is fair to say that disruption, while it's very difficult, also creates economic opportunity. And there are all sorts of new, companies that set up, for example, to make masks. Just to give an obvious example, it's not inconceivable that you might have seen significant increases.
170,000 new companies to make PPE. Honestly, does that sound credible?
No, I'm not suggesting, of course, that all of those would have been doing PPE, but there's all sorts of, for example, if your company that you currently had was having a difficult time, that might be a reason to set up a new company doing something different. Equally, if you were a self-employed trader and you wanted to be incorporated so that you could access some of the government schemes more straightforwardly, that would be another reason to start up a company. So, I'd very happily ask Companies House for some analysis of kind of what they think makes that up. I'm just saying I don't think we can jump smoothly to the conclusion that that is necessarily an indicator of anything adverse.
It would certainly appear to have been a warning sign that needed to be more closely investigated. Were you aware there had been a big increase in company registrations? Did you become aware of it through other means? Did Companies House alert you to the fact that there might be something happening that wasn't correct?
As I say, I wasn't in the seat at the time, so I'm afraid I'd need to check the record about what correspondence was received or what conversations were had.
Okay, thank you. I may want to come back to other questions on Companies House later on, but that's me for just now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Over to Kate Ossamore MP.
Thank you. If I can get my mask off. I just would like to draw my line of questions to the frequency and robustness of annual reporting. I think we can all agree that annual financial reports are a main feature of any corporate reporting. But in some quarters, there is lots of criticism about annual reporting because it is past reports, it's past activity, and it doesn't actually show new or potential risk. In essence, the horse has already bolted. So I'd like to ask Sarah Mumby. Sarah Mumby, if you could tell the committee what mechanisms are available to use to report any key risks to a minister once a new directive has been issued?
Sorry, just to confirm, you mean a minister within the department?
Yes, within the department, yeah.
I'm almost wondering how to answer that question, because actually that's sort of the ordinary course of doing business and what we do all the time. So just to take these sorts of programmes that we've just been talking about just as an example, ministers were receiving very regular updates, partly because we knew they were high risk. Ministers across government have been involved in repeated sessions specifically about fraud in the context of COVID, for example. So ministers would have been receiving briefing for those. Ministers have been meeting, for example, with the banks in the context of the BBL, so they would have been receiving discussion for those. We also have, just in a sort of slightly more systematic way, our implementation and delivery directorate, who are responsible for essentially sort of overseeing our performance on a cross-scheme basis, regularly report to ministers across our top 20, 40, 60 programmes, what status, what do we think is delivering, what are the key risks. And we would typically, that process sometimes kicks up schemes that for whatever reason may have not lately received a great deal of ministerial attention. Schemes sort of come in and out of focus naturally. Occasionally we pick up through that process, and then what we tend to do is gather actually the full ministerial team to do a deep dive specifically on whatever it may be. I mean, we recently, these aren't really schemes that don't receive a lot of attention, but just to give you examples, we recently went through one on the Automotive Transformation Fund. We've also done one on Sizewell, to bring the full ministerial team up to pace and to receive challenge. So it's not quite that we have a sort of lots and lots of specific mechanisms, although we have a few. I mean, my personal view is it is the core job of the civil servants running these teams to manage the risk and to inform ministers about that risk and debate potential responses to that risk with ministers. So I think it's that what you're describing is just absolutely the core business of responsible running of the department.
So would you say that whilst you are reporting and showing where there's risk, that you are being listened to?
Yes.
So how have we got to a place where there has been so much fraud and so much activity which has shown that nobody has been very clear or has been able to, what's the word I should use, identify that their fraud could take place?
I think because these schemes, because of the very unusual circumstances in which they were set up, in which there was a need to support so many companies at such scale in a completely unprecedented way, with a very high degree of urgency and an atmosphere of real impending crisis, economic crisis, on top of the medical crisis that, of course, we were facing. We set up on both the loans and grants schemes with a level of fraud risk and error risk that we would never have normally tolerated, either as officials or, I think, as ministers, right? This is really, truly exceptional circumstances. And that has meant since then we have all been collectively seeking to manage those challenges as best we can. But the best way of managing fraud is preventing fraud from happening in the first place. That's a truism. I don't claim that to be a sort of great point of wisdom. And in these schemes was very consciously decided that we couldn't do that without further imperiling the future of many, many small businesses. So we've been managing that since.
With such a wide-ranging remit, would you not think that it would have been better to release the accounts with precise details as things were happening, as opposed to waiting until the annual reports were released?
I guess I'm not sure the accounts. I'm not sure the accounts would be the mechanism for doing
about
that.
some of the spending rather than the accounts. I think, aren't you?
The spending. I'll change the word to spending.
Because the accounts obviously have to be signed off.
We do, of course, report through all sorts of other channels. So, the local authority grant scheme, just to take an example, I can't remember exactly the cadence. I'm going to say monthly, but it might not be monthly. It might be slightly less frequent than that. We report amounts spent So each individual programme will have its usual transparency arrangements. So I think that's where we would expect to see that. I mean, Tom, I don't know if there's anything that you would add about our reporting.
We also report, obviously we have internal management accounting reports each month for the management and ministers to consider, but we also report every month on a very detailed basis to Her Majesty's Treasury, which every department has to do and load onto something called the Oscar system. And there hasn't been a convention so far of releasing in-year expenditure reports, if you like. I appreciate you don't mean fully audited accounts, and that's why we haven't done it.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
I'll just ask them, Mr. Taylor. I mean, we've had the COVID cost tracker that the NEO put together, which the Treasury is going to continue in a form.
Mm-hmm.
It's been an extraordinary period of time, and maybe Ms. Humberston, I don't really want to come in on this, but do you not think there's maybe some benefit for the taxpayer who's funded all of this to see how you're performing, to have some sort of tracker about the money that's gone out the door from your department?
I can definitely see the benefits of that. I read the committee's report, which was released yesterday, and I can definitely agree the value of the NEO's work on this. As I say, it would. I think there would have to be a central government, a Treasury-led decision as to what the whole of government should do in terms of in-year reporting and on what terms. That's not something that I have the authority to innovate.
Just put it this way, if there was a parliamentary question, if Ms Ossamore had put this as a parliamentary written question, what information would your ministers be able to release on the basis of its current spending? Because given that's not audited, and I understand that there would need to be some consistency across government, but would you... we often get answers that are inadequate, not particularly from your department, I'm suggesting, but on these questions. Would you be able to provide that information if we were to ask that question?
It depends what the type of information is. Sorry,
that's very vague. I mean, what information could you provide then if you were asked a specific question?
We could provide information on which we had a sufficient degree of certainty on. So a good example, as the Permanent Secretary said, is the amounts that we've distributed to local authorities. That's a very simple... it's literally money out of our bank account into local authorities' bank accounts. That's a very transparent thing. I think we do actually report that in any case on a regular basis. But things such as how much, if we just take that example for a moment, how much has the local authority then distributed of those funds? Well, that depends on reporting from the local authorities, which we're not entirely in charge of, and they're very busy administering the schemes. And then, secondly, a much more difficult question, such as how much fraud and error has there been in it.
Which we're discussing. But there is information. I mean,
there is information.
To underline Ms Ossamore's point, there is information that you could put out in real time.
And we do put out the grants information, I understand, Kim.
We do, that's right. We have two sources of information. Obviously, we've got our normal transparency data, which we publish on the .gov.uk website, and that's up to date. We usually take 2 or 3 months to get that out. And also there's the Cabinet Office grant tracker, where all the information gets published as well as soon as we manage to get that uploaded.
I mean, just we are concerned, as you see from our report yesterday, to publish actually formally today. But you obviously get a sneak preview in Whitehall. There we go. But that's really critical for us as a committee that the public can see how money is being spent. Anyway, but Ms Ossamore was making the point, so back to Ms Ossamore.
I didn't get a sneak preview. I actually read it this morning.
Thank you. And lastly, from me. Ms Munby, could you tell the committee, given your department's large inflated budget, has there been any discussions for an additional permanent secretary that deals with high-risk projects, similar to what we've been discussing today, and a permanent secretary that can actually report to Cabinet as well, not just report to yourself? Has there been any discussions?
Well, so you might have noticed that second permanent secretaries are coming into fashion. I think it's fair to say that they are one of those things that is probably influenced a little bit by fashion, and certainly it's been a topic of discussion for BEIS too. I mean, we've recently seen a second permanent secretary appointed at the Department for Transport, and it may well be that we end up in the same position in BEIS. I would reflect, though, that I think it's really important to just say on behalf of my team that it's not the permanent secretary who fixes all of the problems, and we should be careful about sort of falling into a great man or great woman model of leadership where I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by a fantastic team of Directors General and Directors, And while it may well be that we should consider adding a second permanent secretary, I don't think we should imagine that that's the transformative solution. It's a team game.
That's part of the wider discussion, but I think it's just about responsibility, and it will fall on the permanent secretary ultimately. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, of course, as Ms Mumby is very well aware, she's the accounting officer, so even with a second permanent secretary sharing the load, there is one accounting officer in a department, which makes life clearer and simpler for us. Can I just to pick up first, before I go into some other points, some points in response to some of the questions that Mr Grant was asking. You talked about the percentage of fraud and error dropping in tranche 1, cohort 1 of grants. That is, in the sample that you looked at, it was 8.9%, and you believe that's coming down. Can you tell us what size of sample you've managed to sample so far?
So that 8.9% is based on a really small sample. It's 476 loans. We're currently going through a much larger...
So because in your accounts it was 0.05%, so is that... Yeah. But it's more than that since the accounts were published, or...?
We're currently going through a kind of a revision to that estimate, essentially, which we don't have the results of yet. Okay. And that's based on... nearly 5,000 loans.
Okay, so that 8.9% is on the 0.05%.
Exactly, so that's exactly right. Yes.
So it is a very small sample.
Indeed. Hence why I say it's definitely enough to be material, and we're definitely concerned about it. Do I have strong confidence? 8.9%. That's the answer. I definitely couldn't say that.
Okay, and so do you know when? I mean, what's your timescale for being able to be clearer on this? Because we're concerned about this across all of Whitehall departments. To be honest, that these moving figures make us a bit nervous.
I mean, ultimately, the deadline is we will need to be able to use that number for our annual reports and accounts next year. We will have interim numbers clearly before that, and if those numbers are appropriate to be shared, I'd be happy to share them.
It would be helpful to see the trajectory, that we will pick the final figure up in next year's accounts. Then we've had, and Mr McKinley's not able to be with us today, has often raised the concern here that local authorities were not always consistently giving out business grants. So a business of a similar type in neighbouring authorities could be treated quite differently. Have you, when you're looking at and doing your evaluation of how local authorities have allocated the money that you've passed down to them to give to businesses, are you evening that out? Are you going to be giving some leeway where if a business said, but the same business next door got the money and you said that's okay? How are you managing that? Because is this where you talk about that margin of error?
So what we're not planning to do, just to be clear, I'm not sure if this is what you were asking, but just to check, what we're not planning to do is sort of rebalance. We're not going to say, this local authority did this local authority did that, so now we're going to give out some more money. No. That's not our intent.
So basically, if the decision's been made already and that business got it or didn't, that's it.
Yes, and it's worth saying that, of course, one of the components of these grants that existed in multiple waves was the additional restrictions grant, which was a conscious, flexible pot for local authorities. Just to give you a picture of what that was for, it's because there are businesses that don't straightforwardly fall into the definition of, say, pubs, but you might be running a taxi company that operates in exactly the area where all the pubs and nightclubs are closed, and you've had a really difficult time of it. The point of the additional restrictions grant was to allow local authorities to support businesses in those kinds of situations. It is true to say that if you create flexibility to respond to local circumstance, the inevitable cost of that is inconsistency. You can't have both local flexibility and fantastic national consistency. And in the case of the additional restrictions grant, we absolutely understand that there will have been different ways that money was used by different local authorities, and we have to... they all got the right amount of money, as it were. The question of exactly who they gave it to is one that we delegated because they understood the local circumstance.
Because I certainly know in my area there were certain examples of very different types of businesses, because I represent an interesting set of business models, I think is fair to say, in my constituency. So are you going to be looking at any evaluation, though, of how that fund was spent? Because gives you quite a lot of rich information about the nature of business and different local economies.
Yeah, so, it's worth just commenting maybe on evaluation in general. Ipsos Mori are doing evaluation of the scheme for us overall. As you can imagine, I mean, I won't give you kind of chapter and verse, but that's a very full evaluation of all sorts of different aspects of the scheme, including the different waves, the different types of grants, what their impact was. And there's quite a lot of detailed and technical work to do, because one of the things I've talked to the committee about before is it's actually really challenging to evaluate the individual schemes as part of the COVID response, because furlough, loans, grants are all interacting. And I think we can quite confidently say that the package as a whole, we already have enough evidence looking at the economy to be able to say the package as a whole was successful. The question of the individual contributions of individual programmes is one that's going to need. I mean, it's a sort of it's a really quite technical question that will take time to unpick.
Actually, because some businesses are interesting business models. I just wanted to pick up on the issue about. You talked about a 1,000-fold level of fraud increase with the schemes that you had to oversee. You also obviously sought ministerial directions, which I think we would accept as absolutely the right thing to do. Well, you had no choice really as accounting officer. So given that you had those ministerial directions going out, did you not think at that point that maybe there was a need to increase the level of fraud support you had in the department from 2 people to...
We did. So, we began increasing that fraud team immediately because we knew... But the timescales were pretty short here. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that it wasn't a long wait, but COVID came. We were launching these schemes, mere weeks later.
Well, who were you recruiting to be fraud officers? Were they civil servants or people with expertise from other sectors?
Primarily, actually, in those early days. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, what we were actually doing is taking experienced government counter-fraud professionals from other departments. I mean, it's fair to say, by the way, that one of the challenges in those early days was that there were lots of people seeking to do that.
Yes, well, that's exactly my point. But basically, you took existing fraud professionals within the civil service. You didn't take general civil servants to become fraud.
No,
and you didn't bring people in maybe from the outside.
We may well have brought people in from the outside. I mean, Kim, you might be able to comment.
Yes, that's correct. We brought in people who were ex-police officers experienced in fraud, so that once the Crime Stoppers line was set up, then we could analyse the typologies of types of fraud and then feed that back through UK Finance, so to go to the lenders, and they would be aware to spot that.
Okay, so that was, and any of those people still working for you, or did?
No, they were contractors. So we then moved on to recruit professional counter-fraud experts with the help of the Cabinet Office.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I just wanted to move on a bit to generally how the financial difficulties you're facing and the fact that your accounts are qualified mean that there's money that you don't know yet if you'll get back for the taxpayer. All of these financial constraints will have an impact, Ms. Mumby, on what you can deliver as a department. And you're a very, very wide range of departments. Things like, your nuclear decommissioning work takes up a very high percentage of your budget alone, and you can't presumably let that all go. So how are you going to, what are you going to drop? What are you going to not do? Or are you going to just look at efficiencies across the piece in order to balance your books?
Well, we've obviously just come out of a 3-year spending review. I mean, and in some sense, at a capital funding level, sorry if I'm saying something sort of obvious here, but the spending review kind of answers for you the question of what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, because you get funding for some of it and you do that, and you make bids that you don't get funded and you don't do those. So in that sense, it's sort of simple. You may not always entirely like the answers, but it's clear. Similarly, with Ardell-funded programmes, many of those are either funded or not. You then do end up with, particularly when it comes to people who are funded through admin, you do end up with a kind of a question about how do you prioritise these resources. The picture for us over the 3-year SR is we've got big increases in R&D spending. That, of course, while you do need more people to manage that to some degree, most of that is going through UKRI or other agencies, so it doesn't have that much immediate impact on your
That's all been fully paid for, isn't it? Because I noticed the advert for chair is out, and for ARIA, for example.
That's right. That's right.
And that's all been funded through the SR.
That's all been funded. So you on the one hand, you've got an R&D increase. The one I'm sort of more concerned about, going directly to your question about managing trade-offs, is that we've got significant new capital programmes on net zero buildings, on hydrogen and carbon capture, and on energy, including nuclear, which you mentioned. A critical priority for me is to ensure that those substantial new capital programmes or continuing capital programmes are properly supported with the right level of resource. The consequence of that is that I've had to ask teams from right across the department to look very carefully at their activities and make sure that we're pursuing efficiencies wherever we can, and that we're prepared in some cases to take schemes that may have been running for some time and say, has this scheme reached the end of its life? We haven't yet closed that business planning process with ministers, so I can't tell you the results of it today, but that's the shape of it.
To say, it would be quite a revelation if we actually see certain things that have been going for years that no one's noticed actually stopping in a department. Do you think you're going to be successful in that?
We're having a good go. It's fair to say that our ministerial team are keen to close some tabs.
Well, there we go. There's a first time for everything. Sorry, I'm a bit cynical about this. We know there's sometimes teams in departments that no one knows what they're doing because they've been there such a long time. But the result of very good work, of course.
If I may, just on that point, I think because of this picture that we essentially have got a flat resource profile and a growing capital profile. We had the same picture at SR last year. With the help of teams in the department, we have been put in a position where we have had to very thoroughly scrub. And I'm pretty confident we don't have any teams in the department who, are sort of in a dusty corner. We have thoroughly flushed out any dusty corners. And that's absolutely, the right thing to do for the public purse.
Refreshing to hear. And you mentioned there net zero, hydrogen, carbon capture. A large amount of your work is dealing with delivering on the government's approach to net zero. We obviously discussed this when we're going to massive depth today because we have looked at it before. But you've got money going in. And one of the things that you need to do is also track what the outcomes are. So this is not just about money, but actually getting that carbon reduction. And how is it going, tracking with what other departments do? It's very early days yet, but it's not all down to you, but there will be an expense on your department to deliver something that other departments will actually be delivering, you see what I mean? So because you've got to keep a track on what they're doing. You're responsible for that 300 and how many pages was it, document that you had in front of you last time?
I hope you've read all of the annexes.
Yeah, well, I haven't quite, as I was going to say, you're going to now test me on annex, so the last annex, I haven't got that far, I must admit.
So what I was reflecting listening to your question is there's sort of two elements of this. The first is tracking essentially carbon delivery. So, the core bit of cross-cutting responsibility that we have in this space is ensuring that essentially the carbon emission targets that were set by sector or element of the economy are being delivered on, because we need to be able to understand that in order to make the strategic decision that, for example, maritime is not doing as well as we hoped. That isn't a fact, I'm just conceptually. Therefore, we really need to double down more on buildings. And the sort of formal process for managing that is we'll be publishing an annual update document to the net zero strategy, which will be the moment at which we sort of crystallise that discussion of how are we doing on carbon. I suspect the first few will be relatively, I can't believe I'm about to use this word, but relatively boring in the sense that you don't get big shifts. These are long-term journeys, but over time we'll start to see places of over and under delivery, and we may need to consider rebalancing. On the point about money, I'm interested in, DFT. You've made some commitments around carbon reduction. It's not for me. I'm not the accounting officer around spending money to deliver that. That's for Bernadette.
But if, let's say, you talked about the example there, say maritime versus buildings, or you could say vehicles versus buildings, whatever. If a department's not delivering on its schedule, somebody's got to be making the argument in Whitehall, not just at ministerial level, about actually a bit more resource into battery technology for cars would mean that target gets met quicker, or we could ramp up the installation programme for housing or whatever it may be. So, yeah,
Exactly.
But you'd be directing that rather than spending on it. But do you think just the resource and dealing with it, the skills you're going to have to monitor that are immense, and yet you're stretching, as you just said, your people very thin?
Yes, so maybe two things to say. I mean, one is, of course, it was exactly the same sorts of discussions that we had in the run-up to the net zero strategy. So the various official and ministerial groups that meet across Whitehall to exactly talk about what are the trade-offs, what's the picture, are kind of well set up, well functioning. They're quite mature now, have been running for some period, and ultimately, of course, go up to the CAS, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And as I've said to the committee before, the ultimate sanction isn't that an official in DFT is going to sort of receive an angry letter from me. The ultimate sanction is that it goes up through kind of ministerial control and back down into the relevant department, which could be us, as it were, whoever is not managing to deliver. It's also worth saying that the departmental ODPs, which are the plans that departments have to put together to kind of say what it is they're doing, what the targets are, provide another means right across Whitehall, not just on net zero, but that's one, for tracking what people are doing. And we have a cross-cutting outcome in our ODP around net zero delivery, into which other departments have had to feed in, quite sort of specifically what it is they are doing and aren't doing and how they think that will work. And so insofar as Whitehall has a brilliant tracking system, it is the ODPs, and that system is honed in on tracking net zero on top of all of the kind of bespoke arrangements that we've put in place, given the importance of the agenda.
Who's going to be monitoring when the money that goes in, whether it actually delivers on the outcomes that you
We will be monitoring whether the carbon outcomes are delivered. Accounting officers in departments will be monitoring whether those outcomes have been delivered in a value for money way.
Well, we will be producing our report on net zero very soon, and we will be coming back to this issue repeatedly, so I won't go into that much more now. You've got a big department. You've got a lot to deliver. How are you managing to recruit people with the right skills? Have you got the right skills currently in the department to deliver on the challenges that are ahead of you?
The short answer to do we have the right skills for where we will want to be in 3 years' time is no. So I think there's quite a substantial skills journey for the department, which is really about recognising that while we have always had big delivery programmes in the department, the proportion of our people who are doing, to oversimplify, delivery work as opposed to policy work, I think that distinction can be a bit sort of over purist, but in a simple way, a higher proportion of our people will be doing delivery versus policy, and so hiring in more delivery professionals over time is going to be important. We've already made some really good starts on that. As you can imagine, that journey's been going for a while. Big increases in the number of qualified project delivery professionals across the department, big increases in our number of MPLA qualified SROs, etc. But it's a journey, and it's going to be
MPLA, Major Projects Leadership Academy. That's the civil service programme done at Oxford, isn't it? So.
That's right, thank you. That's the sort of gold standard for if you're going to be the senior responsible officer for a serious delivery programme, you should really have the MPLA. So all of that is taking place. It's worth saying that 18 months, 2 years ago, we, as I mentioned earlier, created a new directorate within the department specifically, rather than to deliver individual programmes. The Implementation and Delivery Directorate is there specifically to look at, as a department, are our capabilities in place? Is our reporting in place? Is our risk management correct? What are the cross-cutting issues? Are our portfolios structured correctly? Those sorts of system-level delivery issues for the department. One of the things that team has done, just to give you a kind of a live tidbit, is set up something called the Project Assistance Team, which is project professionals who specifically can be short-term mobilised into new programmes. Because one of the real challenges actually in this is if a programme comes up quite fast, which they on occasion do, these are the perfect example, but there are others too, you can of course hire people in, but hiring people in takes a bit of time. You actually need your kind of your Marines ready to go, and we now
a different light, Ms. Mumby.
we now have that to help us with that very beginning phase where project setup and design is so critical.
That's quite interesting, because one of my next questions was about how you're managing risk. We've talked a lot about the loan schemes and the risks there, but there's other risks you've got. I mean, many. If you wanted a department packed full of risks, you've got lots of big projects. Is that part of your strategy in managing future risks, having that team there, so you can get things set up?
Yes,
well,
I mean, probably they're more in the risk reduction.
Which is part of managing risk, isn't it?
Separately, we now have a pretty well-structured kind of risk reporting process in which we track risks across the department. P&R, which is our committee within the department that reports to EXCO and looks at risk, looks at the results of that reporting. We also ask leadership teams to look at the results of that reporting. I mean, I don't think that reporting is the answer. I mean, it's certainly helpful, but it's not the point. I actually think much of this is about having the right risk culture. And while I hesitate to look for upsides from the experience of 2021, I do actually think that the combination of what we're discussing today and, if I may say so, the Green Homes Grant has actually had a very positive impact on risk and delivery culture in the department, because we have had, borne very forcibly upon us some of the real-world challenges that come in delivering schemes that come upon us rapidly, where we're not able to put up upfront checks. So, it's very normal now in the department to hear very robust and challenging conversations at the beginning of programmes, because we've had such real-world examples of the challenges that come if you don't have those conversations upfront.
Did you similarly find the fact that you had to issue ministerial directions because of the speed of things? Did that crystallise your thinking as well?
I think...
It's quite an interesting process when you have to write that letter. It's not a light thing you do, is it? It's quite
no.
So those people who don't understand.
Indeed. I mean, there are
you have to go through a certain formula and lay out certain thinking, really.
Yes, and I mean, I think it's also worth saying that the impact that I'm talking about on risk culture within the department, of course, is also relevant to ministerial risk culture. Because we've all experienced what does it look like if you have schemes that are really, the things that we're discussing today around fraud and error are really challenging and really important and really difficult. And ministers are experiencing that too. And that certainly makes everyone breathe a little harder in the conversation about a new scheme where you're talking about, we think it's advisable to put in this fraud control. I think right across government, actually, those conversations are going better now than they were.
Does it make you more risk averse? Because there's always going to be risks in any government policy.
I think more. I don't think more risk averse but more conscious of managing risk. Conscious of discussing, what's the impact of this control? Do we want to take it? Are we sure we've really considered it? More considered about risk.
And what have you done? And maybe Ms. Humberston could come in on some of this. That when we've looked at this managing risk, particularly around fraud and error, it was very apparent that DWP and HMRC, the Department for Work and Pensions, and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs were better equipped to deal with it. They were used to dealing with that. They had a process and a thinking in place. So, Ms. Humberston, did you try and learn any lessons from how they managed it and how the departments managed risk over fraud and error?
Yes, we have. So we've taken advice from the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function. We have a PIC project and investment committee where outline business cases, full business cases come through. One of the requirements now to go through PIC is that there is a fraud risk assessment in place, and it's one of the things that we check, and my counter-fraud team perform those fraud risk assessments on behalf of the policy teams that are delivering.
Okay, I mean, when you were talking at the very beginning, Ms. Mumby, about the estimate for fraud and error in the bounce back loan, in the local government schemes, particularly that first cohort, we've since I highlighted that's a very small sample. You're trying to manage down that risk. What process are you going through to really crystallise the number of fraudulent claims? Can you perhaps go into a bit more detail on that? Maybe,
yeah.
Or maybe Ms. Humberston.
I mean, why don't I start, and then Kim, if there's anything I miss, add. we're essentially doing a similar sort of process, but at a much larger scale with a much bigger sample. One of the reasons, sorry to be boring, but one of the reasons you need a bigger sample is because you've got quite a lot of different kinds of grant in here. You've got the 3 cohorts, and even within the cohorts there are multiple different types of grant. So we need to have a representative sample from within each type in order to give a much richer story for the picture overall. And that sample, not only will we be able to have a bigger sample, but we'll also be able to do fuller checks, ultimately with greater involvement from the LAs. I talked about the limitation of our current numbers. I am worried about the small sample. I'm more worried about the fact that, for example, where we're saying that there is a risk that this particular grant might have been made in error, we have not yet closed that question down by going back over, kind of in conversation with the LA, why did you do it? Does that make sense? What does it look like? Are we collectively happy that this is truly a case of error? At the moment, it's a relatively sort of top-down central view on the problem, as opposed to a view that brings together the perspectives of the department and LAs. And the reason for that has been that the reality of administering these waves of grants has been a real pressure on LAs, and I think LAs have responded really well and powerfully, but they can only do what they can do, and it's not been possible for them to carry out all of the kind of detailed sampling and assurance activities at the same time as being asked to deliver, cohort 2 of the loans, cohort 3 of the loans. And ministers, for good reason, have prioritised delivery of the money over doing the sampling work faster.
There's been a lot of pressure, but it's been business as usual. COVID has been the business as usual now for 2 years. So the first 6 months was a bit of a shock to everyone, but the local authorities were doing regular returns to the department for levelling up housing communities, for example. Isn't there a danger that the longer this goes on and that you use the excuse, if you like, that they're busy doing something else, that money's gone out the door and it will never really be recovered?
I mean, I think we are now at the point where I sort of hesitate to say this because it seems so ironic, because we've been here before and where we've sort of thought we've reached the end of the road. But it's not in any of our plans or expectations that there should be any further rounds of grants, right? And we're also at a point where the systems and methods for grant delivery, including prepayment checks, are kind of approaching maturity.
Yeah, so if there was another round, we'd be in a better place.
So we're getting to the point now where we're planning, for example, the kind of full collection of data from all LAs across all grants about expected error, fraud, the sort of systematic, going beyond sampling into the sort of the full data collection period to happen over the next quarter or so. So we're definitely in that mode now. It would have been good if we had been in that mode earlier, but it just hasn't been possible for LAs to manage the large number of concurrent pressures that they have been facing, in particular the pressure that we have been putting on them to deliver further cohorts of loans.
But are you confident they've got good records that you can audit? Or you can go in, if you need to do a deep dive, you're confident that you can do that?
I'm confident we can go in. I don't think I could comment today on the kind of the quality
just that we've
of record
seen in
keeping.
central government there was some very poor record keeping. For a civil service that's supposed to be the gold standard on keeping records, among maybe other things. But there was poor, in other departments particularly, very poor record keeping. So you're hoping that you'll be able to find this in local authorities that they have kept good.
Yes, and I mean clearly it's sort of at base the thing that we're measuring is at heart it's payments out to a known set of businesses that featured on local authority databases.
But your accounts have been qualified on the basis that you're not quite sure where this money's gone. So I just was hoping for a little bit more confidence that you're confident that you will find some audit trail, basically, that the money, that if you do some deep dives, you can go down. Mr. Taylor's nodding.
Yeah, I can see.
It sounds like he's going to give you some reassurance here. Let's hope.
Well, I mean, it was clear. It was clear in the guidance that we gave to local authorities, with one or two exceptions, that they were acting as our agents under the grant memoranda. And as such, the expectations were put on them for records keeping and being able to audit, and that we would need to come back and reconcile this information. And so I feel that's a basis for confidence that we can have. In answer to your question as to what we're doing to refine the estimate, as Permanent Secretary said. On the cohort 1, we're increasing the sample to near on 5,000 instead of the original 476 or whatever it was. And then on cohort 2, even larger still, over 12,000. We took advice from the ONS as to how to devise the sample, and we did it very crudely, I think, in the first one, for the set of accounts that you see before you, because of the time that we had. But we took advice from the ONS on improving the precision and took their advice on things like stratifying it by subgroups and areas and scheme geography and so on. So we'll have a statistically robust sampling frame to go after. That should give us confidence that we can narrow down the bounds of the confidence interval around these estimates. But crucially, as the Permanent Secretary said, this does depend upon the capacity and the willingness of the local authorities to be able to respond to our requests.
So so this is taxpayers' money, and even if it's an error at the margins, this is still money that could have been spent on something else. So if a company got it in error, but not through their own error, it was allocated in error, where does the buck stop? With the council that allocated it inappropriately, or which they have to pay back, or with the department?
So when we were writing the grant memoranda, the grant agreements that went out to local authorities and indeed to individuals, we made clear that the department would stand behind any fraud and error, subject to local authorities taking all reasonable and practicable steps to have administered it properly in the first place, and then secondly, taking all reasonable and practical steps to recover any debt that was due from any fraud and error. After that point, it is very squarely...
How long then does that process play out?
Well, it really depends. I mean, different local authorities have different approaches to debt recovery. They have to take a minimum approach, which is the invoice and then 2 recorded reminder letters. Some have already taken forward active prosecutions. So you can see that there's a variety of practice there. But fundamentally, the issue is that we actually haven't given local authorities at large the headspace yet to be able to do all of the reconciliation work, because we've been asking so much of them in terms of further grants.
If I might just add one thought, everything Tom said is exactly right, but of course local authorities, while the buck stops with us in the way that Tom has described, local authorities of course have their own responsibilities around public money. So regardless of the question of sort of who ultimately pays out, the Section 141 officers in local authorities have sort of accounting officer-like responsibilities, and so and they will of course also be subject to audit, etc., etc. So there is that's not to take any pressure off the processes that we need to ensure we're driving, but there is kind of a separate process for ensuring that local
there's also huge delays in local
good
government audit, which we won't revisit, but you know that it's not by any means a perfect situation. So this brings me back to you, Ms Mumby, about these are the COVID schemes with long tails. So we've got the 10-year bounce back loan schemes, you've got the local authority going through processes. I mean, who pays for the prosecutions actually, incidentally, if a local authority prosecutes, it's them that pays. Mm-hmm. So but if you're standing behind them, there's not much incentive for them prosecuting if they wouldn't normally, on small amounts of money, I guess. So it's a bit like with the bounce back loan schemes. Banks go a certain way, as Mr. Weil reminded us at the beginning, but then ultimately it's you, the taxpayer, through you, that stands behind them. So you've got this, you've got long tails. How are you managing? What's the plan over time to manage all of these financial risks that are still rumbling on? Fraud, error, repayments, which might not come back in, not necessarily through fraud or error, just because companies go bust. How are you keeping a handle on that from your seat as accounting officer? And does it keep you awake at night?
So just maybe sort of 2 elements to the answer. First of all, I mean, it's just worth saying on a very practical basis that we're not in any sense shutting up shop on any of this anytime soon. I talked about the business planning process that we're going through now. The right resourcing for managing the tail of these schemes is a critical priority as part of that process. And indeed, we've continued to put additional resources into the team managing the local authority grants, for example, to mean that we can have more relationship managers for LAs, further sessions to support, help, provide training to LAs. It's certainly not something that I would see as a kind of, a done game from a resource allocation point of view. And then the second part of your question is, okay, so what does that mean for me? Well, these are some of the most substantial financial risks that exist in the department. There are others too of different natures, but these are both in my top 10, definitely probably top 5 things that I'm worried about. So I try not to be kept awake at night, but were I to be awake at night, this is one of the things that would be top of my list.
Well, I would hope the taxpayer would expect that at least you toss and turn a little bit worrying about their money. So, much as I want you to sleep well and do a good day job. But you talked about the full data collection being reported in the annual accounts, but actually, when you've talked about what we know from local authorities, they are under pressure. When you've told us when you're expecting to get your accounts back on schedule, you've got a plan for that. Do you really expect that you'll have information from local authorities, particularly on cohorts 2 and 3 of the funding that you've given them by that point? Mr. Taylor?
I think we will have a very good re-estimate of cohort 1 by the time that we're talking about the 2021-22 accounts. We will have made good strides into the estimation work for cohorts 2 and 3 for sure. On a much more solid sampling base than we started out with cohort 1 because of that ONS advice that I mentioned. But I don't think we can say at this moment, because it is dependent upon...
Okay, so which set of accounts will you be sort of fully back on track?
So it depends what you mean by back on track.
Well, having all the information you've had about all the money that you've put out there and at least a much stronger... I'm putting this very generously, a much stronger idea of the fraud and error in those later cohorts.
So we'd hope in the 2021-22 accounts we'll have a much improved estimate that I think we can be sure of for the whole lot. Yep. Whether it's sufficiently accurate to satisfy both ourselves and the CNAG remains to be seen. I think it's more likely that it would be the following year that we would have the degree of certainty that we would have liked to
24, 25.
That will be 22-23 accounts.
22-23, sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Noting, of course, just in case people haven't quite got this in their head, noting, of course, that the most recent round of grants have gone out really very recently. Mm-hmm. So some of them by that point will be very old, and we think we will have good estimates earlier on those, but some have only just happened.
But as you said yourself, you hope that the later ones are you prevented it
absolutely
at giving an out stage. Okay.
Absolutely.
So there won't be full reconciliations on any of these figures for quite some time.
Well, I'd certainly like to hope that the 21-22 accounts would have full reconciliation in them. What I'm saying is I can't guarantee it because it relies not on the effort of my team solely, but on the effort of local authorities.
Okay, well, there's a lot of worries there about what incentive they've got to pursue it if you're standing behind them. But anyway, I will pause there and turn to Mr. Peter Grant, MP. Mr. Grant, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Ms Munby, I want to look briefly at the Post Office, which is one of the many entities that your department has some responsibility for. Without obviously cutting across the independent inquiry that's currently underway, what's your latest estimate of the total compensation bill that will have to be paid out to victims of the Horizon scandal?
So we've written to both this committee and the BEIS Select Committee in these terms, so I'll refer to that if I may, but you've all got this in writing. So there are two critical elements of this. One is the historic shortfalls scheme, where our current estimated cost of settlement as set out in the Post Office annual report is 153 million. That is just because I know part of the original question that we were answering here was about government funding versus Post Office funding, 89 million of that from Post Office and a provision of 65 from BEIS. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, is the compensation for overturned criminal convictions. Our current estimated maximum potential spend is 780 million, and that is that's an HMG commitment to cover that spend. It clearly will depend on what happens, how much of that transpires, but that's what we've put out as our estimated maximum.
Thank you. The historic shortfall scheme, am I right in thinking that applies to people who weren't convicted but who still were very badly treated. Can I say that number concerns me, because I think the number of people affected by that, although they weren't convicted, the numbers are probably significantly higher. And to give one example of the impact it had, one of my constituents was featured in a number of news bulletins when the inquiry started. She and her elderly mum ran the post office in the village where they lived. They flagged up that something was wrong with the computer system because it kept showing up a discrepancy. The post office spent several months ignoring their warnings, then accused them of fraud, sacked them from their jobs. They had to leave the village they lived in because it went around the village like wildfire, as you can imagine. The postmistress had embezzled money. In fact, the family put in £70,000 of their own money because they thought they must have been making the mistakes that caused the shortfall. Her mum died under the shame of being a fraudster, never lived to know that she'd been cleared. Her daughter is now trying to, first of all, get compensation for herself and get compensation to pay back the family members who bailed them out at the time. How confident are you that that sum of £153 million can come anywhere close to properly compensating people who weren't wrongly prosecuted or convicted, but whose lives in some cases were utterly destroyed by actions that we can now see were utterly indefensible?
And I think it's important, first of all, just before I answer the question directly, to say that we absolutely fully acknowledge that in all sorts of different ways and in all sorts of different circumstances, many postmasters and their families, exactly as you say, have endured really very challenging circumstances, and ones that all of us, and of course our ministers who've acknowledged this in Parliament, very sincerely regret. And the inquiry, I think, is just critical to sort of put on the table. Is going to be the place where we understand exactly what's happened. I'd have to come back on the sort of specific type of case that you're talking about, but certainly I think we have been collectively forward-leaning in historical shortfalls, criminal compensation, in a desire to provide fair and just compensation for people who've been affected. Tom?
If I could just add, it's our best estimate at the moment of the likely liability under the historical shortfall scheme. It is just an estimate. It's not, I should stress, any kind of hard and fast limit. It's not a budget within which we have to live. It's as I say, an estimate. There is an independent panel that's been set up to look at each individual claim under the HSS. I get to see some of the paperwork for that. I know they're doing an incredibly diligent job. Anybody that has any kind of valid claim should be encouraged to come forward and have their case assessed by the panel. And if in due course it turns out that as we go through the caseload, the estimate has proven to be too low, well then it will be increased. It's not a question of anybody being shortchanged. I can assure you of that.
Thank you. Clearly the human cost of this is unimaginable. The committee also has to look at the hard numbers that are involved here. Isn't it the fact that the distinction between costs being met by the post office and costs being met by the government is a false distinction? Because the post office, at the moment, the post office is in negative equity just for providing for their share of the £153 million. If all of that was landing in the post office right now, the choices would be dissolve the post office or bail it out yet again at taxpayers' expense. So isn't it the fact that that overall cost of not far short of £1 billion, directly or indirectly, it's a cost to the taxpayer, isn't it?
It's worth just saying, by the way, just before I answer your question directly, that of course a very large portion of that, the 780 estimate that I talked about for compensation for overturned convictions, is explicitly on the public purse. So at the margin, there are some costs that will be met through existing post office funding, so they're not an incremental cost to the public purse now. You're right, of course, depending on how commercial performance in the post office evolves, ultimately, if the public purse stands behind that, then of course any cost in any kind of public body could ultimately come back to the taxpayer. But whichever way you look at it, we're talking about very significant, multi-hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cost to the public purse to make sure that people who suffered the kinds of things we've just been talking about are properly compensated.
Thank you. One of the things that the directors of a company have to do in their annual accounts and that the auditor has to give a view on is whether it can be regarded as a going concern. Do you have any worries that the ongoing reliance on the post office to bailouts from the taxpayer might actually prejudice their position to be operating as a going concern?
That would be a question for the Post Office Board. I mean, it is not inherently the case that the fact that they receive an element of their money from the public purse, that wouldn't prevent them from being a going concern in and of itself. But obviously the board will look carefully at those questions, as you'd expect any board to.
Thank you. Looking at another area for your department as responsibility over Post Office Limited and other businesses on the regulation of businesses and the regulation of the conduct of businesses. At best, there had to be very senior people in the Post Office who were grossly negligent or grossly incompetent or both. At worst, well, there's no limit to what at worst might be. There could well have been criminal misconduct in some cases. How comfortable are you with the sanctions that you have available to take against directors or officers of a company in those circumstances? Because at the moment it doesn't seem as if anybody from the Post Office has been held to account in any way whatsoever for what happened.
Well, I think in the specific case of the Post Office, and I appreciate this will be an unsatisfying answer, but I think it is important that we wait for the inquiry because it is exactly getting at these questions of what happened. And if we had collectively, received sufficient evidence at some point to believe that there was a clear case to take action against any specific individual, then that would have happened. That's not to say that as the inquiry uncovers more evidence and looks at the problem more fully, such evidence couldn't emerge. Of course it could. More broadly, we do hold, not directly in the department, but through our partner bodies and the Insolvency Service, we do hold powers to disqualify directors. And we talked about using those powers for directors who are found to have behaved inappropriately in the context of COVID loans and the British Business Bank's work, for example. So that there are serious consequences for directors.
There can be. I'm familiar with the changes that were made for the Director's responsibility because I think I actually served on the Bill Committee for that piece of legislation. But the fact is that it's still far too easy for directors to get away with it for a long, long time without ever being held to account, partly because of the complexity that can be involved in taking a prosecution for fraud, for example. But I've previously raised on a number of occasions with ministers in your department and in the Treasury the directors of Blackmore Bond PLC that vanished £46 million of people's pensions. The two directors are still operating dozens of companies registered with Companies House. Between them, there have been scores of breaches of statutory reporting requirements to Companies House, none of which have elicited any sanction because there isn't any sanction that can be imposed in those circumstances other than to compulsorily wind up the company. And sometimes that's in the interests of the company to be compulsorily wound up. I appreciate that Companies House has only recently come under your sort of remit, but what steps are you taking to make sure that either within your core department or within bodies such as Companies House that the anti-fraud system in the United Kingdom is fit for purpose or is made fit for purpose, because it quite clearly is not fit for purpose just now?
So specifically on Companies House, there's two things I think it's worth talking about. One is the Prime Minister has already indicated in the House that we expect to introduce, I believe it's likely to be under the Home Office sponsorship, but an economic crime bill. What that will allow us to do is actually give Companies House new powers and responsibilities. So there are various elements to that. A potential element, for example, is around register of overseas ownership around property to try to make it harder to carry out money laundering activities. all of that work on kind of legislative pieces of the puzzle sits alongside a serious transformation of Companies House in terms of capabilities, which is essentially, I mean, to cut a long story short, essentially really modernising the register so that we can ensure that the right data is on the register, ensure that that data is shared in the right way, strengthening the register as a way of exactly tackling economic crime. I think it's a really exciting journey for Companies House, actually, and is about helping Companies House become an even more powerful agent through the combination of an organisational investment and digitisation and a series of, assuming the bill moves forward and passes, a series of new powers that will really enable us to have much stronger answers to how is Companies House playing its full role in the fight against economic crime.
Thank you. We might differ about the use of your use of the phrase an even more powerful tool. That assumes that it's a powerful tool just now, which might be something that we would have different views on. But are you aware, for example, you mentioned in response to some of my earlier questions about the sharing of data with Companies House, which is all well and good, but are you aware that Companies House don't verify any of the information that's provided to them when a company registers? They don't even do checks to confirm that the person
Yes,
exists.
very much so, and that's absolutely in scope of what I certainly would be keen to see changed through the journey that I'm talking about. It's both a transformation issue, but a legislative one as well. It's around the powers of Companies House.
Thank you. And finally on this, the Chair asked in general terms about the adequacy of your staffing and the skills that they have. Have you begun to estimate how much additional resource Companies House would need to have if they were going to be transformed into an organisation?
Yes.
Are you able to share with us?
Yes, we have. We confirmed £63 million of additional funding for Companies House at the spending review.
Would that be an annual?
I think that's over the scorecard.
Sorry, over the scorecard.
Apologies. It's a 3-year. That's a 3-year figure. So a total of 63 million additional.
Right. What would be your estimate of the increase in annual staffing costs necessary? Is that wrapped up in that 63 million?
That's wrapped up in that 63. That will be a lot of that is staffing costs, but it's also the investment required to digitise systems, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Kate Green, MP, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of other questions, if I may, on Companies House, and specifically in relation to the application of compulsory strike-offs, where it's well known among unscrupulous directors that a compulsory strike-off wipes out liabilities, including liabilities to, for example, HMRC or employment tribunal payments, as well as other civil penalties. How confident are you that Companies House is proactively ensuring that where compulsory strike-off takes place because of non-filing and non-compliance, it is not being used by directors as a way of avoiding liabilities that they would otherwise be required to meet?
I don't have a good enough answer to be comfortable giving one today. I'm happy to come back to you in writing.
That would be very helpful, and I think it would be very helpful in the context of what you've just been saying in response to Peter Grant about the modernisation of the register and the way in which it enables Companies House to be more assertive, if we could also be confident that they would be more proactive. At the moment, it seems that if a company doesn't provide the necessary filing information, they're contacted by Companies House. If they don't hear anything back, they're struck off. If there's any objection to that strike-off from third parties, they are required to be very, very informative and put together a great deal of information to challenge the strike-off. I think what we would welcome as a committee is information on how the modernisation programme will actually redress that imbalance to ensure that there's proactive management of the compulsory strike-off process so that it's not used as a means of allowing directors to avoid responsibilities.
Yes, your question is very clear. I think it's a question of the extent to which that is or isn't included in the proposed measures for the bill, and I will need to come back to you on that.
Another question, if I may, Chair. If it is possible to provide us with annual figures over perhaps the last 3 years, or indeed perhaps going back to 2015, since we've seen, I gather, a 50% increase in the number of compulsory strike-offs since 2015. The losses to the public purse in terms of non-payment, for example, of debts to HMRC as a result of compulsory strike-off. I think the committee would be very interested to see those figures.
We'll very happily pass that question on to Companies House and come back to the committee with whatever is possible.
Thank you.
This exchange about Companies House has rather highlighted the needs for skills in your department. Who oversees Companies House? Well, not who by name, but what structure you've got to oversee Companies House?
So it's the same for all our arm's length bodies or partner organisations, as we call them in the department. I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that Companies House, of course, there are many people with a great deal of expertise inside Companies House itself.
Yes, but you're needing to assure...
Absolutely. I only just wanted to emphasise that...
we completely get that.
That there's a lot there. We have, inside one of our Director General-led groups, Market Frameworks, we have a team, as we do for each of our arm's length bodies, a sponsor team, where there is in this case, there's a director, for example, who has responsibility for managing the Companies House relationship.
What skills have they got? The right skills to oversee this modernisation programme and assure you that it's going well?
I mean, yes, or we wouldn't have appointed them into that role. I realise that's a sort of...
It's just that there's a lot of civil servants, let's be honest, who are bright generalists, I think it was, or mandarins, depending how high up they get. But a bright generalist might do a perfectly good job, but there might well be specific skills, well, there are specific skills your department has across a range of issues which we touched on earlier.
Yeah, and one of the challenges is that to oversee and sponsor an organisation like Companies House, this is just the thing that was making me hesitate and answer your question. Of course, we could put somebody there who's really an expert in digital transformation, but you might also say to me, well, Sarah, I think you should have somebody there who really understands company law, and you might have...
You might have a bit of everything.
There's exactly. So what we're trying to do is find the right balance of skills for people who occupy that role. There's also, of course, a degree of skills in sponsoring and managing an arm's length body, which is another level of... So you don't find somebody necessarily who has absolutely the full
package.
But it's
not one person, is it? It's somebody...
No, it's a team, of course.
Have you got the right skills? It's just the answer to that question.
I wouldn't say of all the skill things that keep me awake at night, I wouldn't say the skills of the team sponsoring Companies House are particularly on my concern.
I think you picked up the concern of the committee about it and some of the start figures that we've highlighted. And I just want to before we finish, go back to the issue of, right from the beginning, you were talking about how you're estimating fraud and error. We've talked a lot about the sample size and how you... But there's one thing about getting the estimate right and getting it through the NEO as accounts without qualification. But there's also then chasing down the fraud and the error. And we touched on a bit on how local authorities will do it. So what are you going to be doing proactively? And have you done a business case for what investment you need in skilled people to chase down fraud? Because if you're HMRC, you'd be getting a good return for it. Can you get a similar good return for that investment?
Yep, so as Tom mentioned earlier, the sort of first step in the process, I'll come to what we're doing in just 1 second. The first step in the process is that local authorities are sort of the first line of recovery. They go through that process. Once they've completed the process, then we take on the recovery. So in a much more direct way than we do in the case of the loans. We're using Indesa to carry out that loan recovery, the grant recovery work. So if you've received a grant in error and you've been invoiced and written to twice by your local authority, the next thing is that you will be put over to Indesa, as it were. And of course, we have an agreed set of what they will and won't do and how to manage that process. And we will invest in that contract up to the point at which
So have you got a business case for what level of investment and what people you'll need? But you're using Indesa as you're outsourcing it. What level of investment you'll need for and what return you'll get for that?
Yes, just the sort of subtle point I would make is that it's also something where you learn as you go.
Except that, I mean, when a local authority's gone through this process with other of its creditors, you'd have an idea of how much is written off, for instance.
Yes, sure. All I mean, is that it's the sort of thing where what you actually do typically is you set up a payment by results type framing. So it's not sort of you decide up front you're definitely going to invest X and you're going to get Y. Where we're still getting value for money, it's a little bit like what Tom was talking about earlier. It's not that there's a sort of hard upper limit to how much we would invest. We'll continue putting into that process until the point at which we don't see value for money anymore. So we do have a business case, but it's also a dynamic
Okay, so how much
decision.
do you think you're going to get back?
We don't know.
So when will you know?
You'll
be able to give us
know-
all better estimates at the very least.
I think probably on a similar timeline. I'd expect that we will have a better understanding of that in time for the annual report and accounts next year, because we will have begun more of that recovery.
Better idea of what you might get back, and then in terms of actually getting it back, how long were the repayment plans typically likely to be? Are you going to give people 5 years, 10 years, a year?
I mean, these amounts are not huge.
Well, yeah.
I don't know exactly what decision we've made on that, but I would be very surprised if we're talking about 10-year repayment plans.
And what's your policy about write-off? I mean, would you have a policy for when you might decide you're just going to write it off?
Yeah, so managing public money stipulates that you pursue all debts until it becomes uneconomic to do so. If you don't, you get to the point where you don't have a realistic chance of recovery and the costs of continuing are greater. I would say, however, you can factor into that the public deterrent effect, as well as just the pure return on money as a commercial might. One of the areas that we've invested in quite heavily and will continue to over the spending review is the National Investigation Service, which works very closely with local authorities and has done some of the high-profile arrests that you've seen on the news in terms of the local authority grant fraud and indeed some of the loan fraud too. We'll continue to invest in those. Those are an important part of our prosecution front.
We do like on this committee a bit of high-profile public deterrence, as well as getting the taxpayers' money back into the Exchequer. So we'll continue to pursue you on those numbers, because we can talk as much as we want about theory, but unless the taxpayers' money is coming back in, whether it's through given out in fraud or error, that's not really fair on the taxpayers. So we'll continue to watch you. But can I thank you very much indeed for your time? We know it's a challenge. We do want to see these accounts back on track. And so you came out quite quick out of the traps, Ms Mumby, promising that would be happening very soon. So, and we hope that they're not qualified in future years. But of course, that's a matter for the CNAG. I don't know if the CNAG would like to say anything as you've qualified these accounts this year before we finish.
Well, I guess just to recognise the amount of sheer hard work that's gone in from both teams to get to a set of accounts in such an unusual year, and I think we do have a good joint plan in place for restoring this to a timely reporting cycle for this year and next year, so I just put that on record.
While timely reporting cycles aren't the only thing we're interested in, it is quite important that we have an idea in real time about what's happening, as I know you will want to as accounting officers. So we look forward to seeing timely accounts for next year, so you'll be appearing in front of us to discuss those, and we hope we'll have clearer figures, as you've described, on the estimates, and hopefully some idea of when the money will actually come back in when it's been poured out. If you can do that, you'll be beating some other departments that seem to be writing off in all but name, but that's a controversial comment, I know, in amongst the colleagues group in Whitehall, but it feels like that to us. So can I thank you very much indeed. The transcript will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. We will be producing a report on this in due course, actually maybe not before the Easter recess just because of our volume of work, but we will let you know when that is. Can I thank you very much indeed. Order.